Correctly with the correct amount.
Nowhere do we need to get hold of the Calvin of history more firmly and more quickly than on the doctrine of worship. Calvin's doctrine of worship is mostly ignored. Well, why is it ignored? Well, it's ignored either because modern readers disagree with Calvin and they know enough to know that they could never reconcile their own views and practices with Calvin, so they simply ignore him, or, as is just as often the case, they simply assume that, well, I am a Calvinist, that's what my friends call me, I do X, whatever X is, it doesn't really matter for the purposes of this discussion. Therefore, that must be what Calvin did. It's widely assumed that that's the way things work. I've had that discussion with a lot of people. No, Calvin didn't have a praise band. Really? No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Not yet. Not even a guitar. Not even a piano. And, to my Dutch friends, not even an organ. Yeah, well, you know, it's not a perfect worship service then, the organ. How can you worship God without an organ? In the spirit of Semper Reformanda, I want to introduce you to the Calvin that we don't know. Well, first, a little bit about Calvin we do know, and that is that we know he was passionate for the glory of God. We all know that. But we don't always know that he was passionate for the glory of God in public worship. We know he's passionate for the glory of God. We like to wax eloquent about Calvin and the glory of God and possessed by the majesty of God, all of which is perfectly true. But for Calvin, being possessed by the glory and majesty of God had concrete consequences for the life of the institutional church and for Sabbath morning services and Sabbath midday services and for Sabbath evening services. He was passionate for the glory of God. He was deeply concerned that we glorify God by worshiping him only as he has commanded. But he was also a theologian of the means of grace, and that's the Calvin that we really don't know. To try to meet God apart from the means of grace is for Calvin Anabaptist fanaticism, because it's divorcing the Spirit from the Word, because the Word is the primary means of grace. It's the thing through which, and chiefly the gospel through which, God meets us and through which he operates, through which he brings us to faith, through which he sanctifies us according to the law of God is the norm for the Christian life, and then confirms all that he has said and done for us and is doing in us in the sacraments, which are signs and seals of his gospel promises. And all those things he considered means of grace. And then we respond with the divinely ordained means, and that is prayer, whether spoken or sung. It's not we who get to decide of what God approves. It is God who has already decided what he will accept and how he will be approached. And it is God who has revealed that moral will unequivocally and clearly in his holy word. So that Calvin's principle of worship was that we may do in worship only that which God has commanded. Quoting here from Bob Godfrey's recent essay, in practice, Calvin purified church buildings by removing all religious images and symbols. Remember, this is Godfrey I'm quoting. Including the cross. He made the reading and preaching of the Bible in the language of the people central to worship. He eliminated rites and ceremonies that were without biblical warrant. He removed musical instruments, and he introduced the singing of the Psalms by the congregation. He restored the Word of God, the gospel of Christ, and a profound sense of meeting with God at the center of worship. Calvin is a theologian of the means of grace. For Calvin, our private piety flows out of our public worship. He was possessed of the vision of God that the Apostle Paul had, that if people should come in and see that God was present in the congregation of Christians, that they would know that he was present, and what would they do? They would fall down before the face of the living God because he is a consuming fire. When people come into our services, how often do they feel like falling down because they've come before the face of the living God? Or have we made them altogether too comfortable with a friendly, seeker-sensitive, user-friendly, therapeutic God who only loves them and wants the best for them? Why didn't Calvin have instruments? Because they were from the time of types and shadows. For Calvin, and I want you to hear me, and I know you're going to. I know what's going to happen because I've said this before, so I'm warning you now. For Calvin, tighten your seatbelt, put your trays in their upright and locked position. For Calvin, he would no more have an organ or piano or drums or guitar than he would bring a bull to the front of the auditorium and slit its throat in public worship, because they both belong to Moses. Now, maybe he was wrong, and maybe there's a way of showing he's wrong. I'd like to see it. We all assume that he was wrong, and we all assume that we know he was wrong, and that somebody somewhere wrote a book showing that he was wrong. I've been looking for that book for several years, and it doesn't exist in English, French, as far as I know, German, and certainly not in Latin, which is probably a language in which it would be written. Calvin operated on a whole set of principles that we have largely abandoned. We comfort ourselves by calling ourselves Calvinists. But I think we could rewrite the necessity of reforming the church. We call ourselves Calvinists, but I think most of us today would be horrified by Calvin's worship service, and I think he would be equally horrified at ours. Exhortation. At the very least, what I hope that you will do when you go to your non-Calvinian service tomorrow is that you will feel uncomfortable and guilty. Because guilt and discomfort is the first step to faith and reformation.